This might be a little different than your typical scary camping story. This didn't happen while I was alone, and it didn't happen way out in the wilderness either. A bunch of friends of mine rented a cabin for a couple of weeks during the summer. Basically, it was just going to be a 2-week party, with lots of beer and weed and the like. Also, I want to point out that our cabin was not way out into the woods. It was in a very recreational area in which many cabins were available for rent. We could actually see several other cabins from our own, so my friends and I built a fire every night. We sat around it and did camp stuff. Traded around ghost stories and stuff. My friend Justin got himself really drunk and revealed that he had brought some fireworks with him. He lit them in the fire. It was pretty cool. Not long after the fireworks went off, though, we were interrupted by a pretty big guy showing up. He came right up to the fire and didn't even say hi or introduce himself. He immediately just started yelling at us about the fireworks. Apparently, he had been sleeping nearby, and the noise had just woken him up. We tried apologizing to the guy, but he wouldn't even let us get a word in. He just kept talking over us about how inconsiderate we were. Justin kept trying to interject and apologize. The guy still wouldn't listen, though, so Justin took a step towards the guy with his hands held out, indicating he meant no harm. That's when the guy turned to Justin and told him that if he took another step towards him, the man would kill him right then and there. That's when I'd had enough. I was nowhere near as big as this guy was, but I had a very loud voice and a very nasty temper. I told the guy to shut the hell up now. All we were doing was trying to apologize to him, and he wasn't letting us get a single word in. That's when he started moving towards me specifically. All 5 of my friends got up, and he realized he wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Clearly, he wouldn't be able to get into a fight with 6 people. Throwing around every swear word I'd ever heard, plus a few new ones, the guy stomped out not long after. We all went inside, and my friends all went to bed before I did. I was still a bit worked up over the incident, and I decided to sit in the living room and read for a while to calm down. I'm a smoker, and even though it wasn't a non-smoking cabin, I always tried to smoke outside anyway. I went out and sat on the swing outside to smoke. That was when I noticed that our fire wasn't all the way out yet. I went over to stamp it out, so it didn't spread somehow during the night and start an accidental forest fire. As I was stamping out the fire, though, I heard some noises coming from behind me. I turned just in time for a fist to slam me in the side of the face. I knew instantly it was the guy from earlier. He pounced on top of me and pulled out a knife. He held it up to my throat and started talking to me, threatening me under his breath. I couldn't say I remembered everything he was saying to me, but the gist of it was him taunting me about how it wasn't easy for me to act like a man without my friends around. He also told me not to call for them, or else. I wasn't sure what to do in that moment, but I was obviously really scared. I thought the guy was just going to kill me here in the night, but he eventually did take the knife away from my throat. He kept pressing his knee into my back, though, so I couldn't get up. I felt the guy grab my hand. He pulled it up and grabbed onto my fingers. I asked him what he was going to do to me, and he told me he was going to give me something to remember him by. He took the 4 fingers of my left hand and bent them back as far as he could. I screamed and felt them all snap. He then told me if I told anyone what happened there, I could look forward to the knife next time. He then left. Well, of course, I was going to tell someone. I got my friends up. Jason was pissed. He grabbed his compound hunting bow, and he was determined to go and kill the guy. I talked him down from it, and told him we should just call the cops instead. I mentioned we weren't even that far out from civilization anyway. We got a police officer to come quickly, and an ambulance as well. The dumbass got arrested, so I guess that's a happy ending at least. I was able to stay at the cabin for the rest of the vacation without having to worry about him coming after me, but all 4 fingers on my left hand were broken, and that was pretty agonizing. So, yeah. This is a sort of weird story from when I was in junior high school. There was this odd guy in my class named Tim. I would have felt quite bad calling him odd while we were growing up, but considering the circumstances of what happened since, I have no problems with it at all. He was one of those students who was quiet. He never spoke in class at all. In fact, even if the teacher called on him to do something, he would never do it. I can't even really remember hearing his voice, or seeing him hang out with anyone, or really doing anything at all. Of course, by the time junior high school came around, students were no longer exchanging Valentine cards with the entire class. I guess that may be why this became such a problem. I still gave out several such cards just because I found it to be a very friendly thing to do, and for some reason that year, I decided to give Tim a Valentine's card as well. I actually didn't sign it though, as we often did with cards at the school. I simply slipped it in through a hole in his locker door. I made sure nobody was around to see me do it either. Somehow though, he seemed to know immediately it was me. I don't know how, but after that he became even stranger than he had been. Our classroom didn't have rows of desks. It was more like several tables placed in a big square in the room. Our teacher felt this fostered discussion. Tim sat down across from me, and he would just stare at me non-stop all day long. I did my best not to make eye contact with him, but he never broke it with me. Lunchtime at school, it was a bit like a combination of lunch and recess. We'd eat, and basically everyone would hang out in the schoolyard. I'd walk around with my best friends, but I noticed that Tim began to sneakily follow us around during the lunch period. He would always remain far enough behind me that I almost wouldn't be able to notice him. He probably couldn't hear anything we were talking about even, but he would still keep following us nonetheless. You can imagine that this all made me think twice about giving him that pity card. I thought I had been doing something nice, but it ended up making my time at school very unpleasant. Even though I actually enjoyed going to school, I now found myself dreading it every day. You can only stand having someone blatantly following you around for so long before it becomes way too much to bear. My friend suggested I just go and talk to the teacher or the principal or something, but I didn't really see how I could do that. Other than watching me all the time, he really wasn't doing anything wrong, just something a bit creepy, unsure of what to do, and not wanting to actually confront Tim directly. I decided to go ahead and write him a note and leave it in his locker like I did with the card. I explained that I really only gave it to him out of pity, and I was getting very uncomfortable with all the attention and following me around. At first, that seemed to have the intended effect that I wanted. Tim stopped staring at me right after the lunch period that day. I felt relieved. That is, I felt relieved until it was time to go home from school, when I opened my locker and found someone had shoved some ripped-up paper through the slots in the locker door. Upon closer inspection, it was clearly the Valentine's card that had originally caused all these problems. Afterwards, the attention from Tim got much worse. He would still continue to look at me, but now there was a malice in his eyes. He wouldn't follow my friends and I around the schoolyard during lunch, but instead he would now hide behind things and watch us as we walked around. I began to be a bit afraid of him and wondered if he would do something to me. About a week after things changed like this, Tim was suddenly absent from school. I had the first relaxing day there in weeks. I was almost upset to see the school day end. When I went to my locker though, I was a bit surprised to see that it was damaged. Someone had broken the lock on it. I approached with caution. I probably should have went and gotten an adult, but I didn't, as I was filled with both curiosity and fright. As I approached it, I put my hand on the door, half expecting to see Tim inside my locker either about to attack me, or maybe he'd killed himself in my locker or something. I wasn't really sure what I was going to find. I opened up the locker door and immediately screamed. There were 5 snakes in my locker. Instinctively, I slammed the door closed and ran right to the principal's office. I explained everything that had been happening with Tim, and that I felt it must have been him who put the snakes in there. The school actually got in touch with Tim's parents, and they didn't seem all too surprised. I'm not absolutely sure what happened to Tim after, but I didn't really see him at school or ever again, and I really didn't mind too much. Okay, so for me to tell this story, I have to admit that I've done my fair share of finding guys on the internet to date. I've never been very good at introducing myself to people, so it was the easiest way for me to meet guys. Of course, it wasn't generally that good. I found guys often lied about their age, and there were lots of guys who'd send pictures of themselves that were clearly not them, or from like 10 years earlier or something. Probably the worst date I had ever been on, though, was with a guy who was actually really good looking. His name was Todd, and he was attractive, very much so, but he was weird as well. I was under the impression that he really wasn't interested in me at all. He really didn't talk much either. He picked me up in his car, and I had to carry the entire conversation. We went to a restaurant, and he barely said a single word the entire time. I kept doing whatever I could to try and prompt him to talk to me, but he just wouldn't respond with much of anything. The ride home was just as awkward. I figured he simply didn't like me, and it was just a bad date. I was so relieved when he dropped me off back at my apartment. I figured I'd never see him again and chalk it off to one bad incident. However, no more than an hour later, he sent me an email telling me he had a good time and he wanted to see me again. I responded by simply saying I was flattered, but I didn't really feel we hit it off so much. I definitely didn't want to have to go through such an awkward experience again. When I got up in the morning, though, there were about 20 emails from that guy in my inbox. He kept on saying about what a fun time he'd had with me, and that he wanted to spend time with me again. I just couldn't go through that silence again, though. I let him know I really wasn't interested, and hoped that would be the end of it all. Almost immediately, he sent me an email back. I really didn't want to read it, but I figured I should. He was insisting I see him again. I didn't respond. After 5 minutes, he sent me another email complaining about why I hadn't responded yet. I was beginning to get a bit worried now. After a few minutes, there was another email demanding I respond right now. He said, "I know you're at your computer. I know you're reading my emails, so why are you not responding?" And that was when I decided the best thing to do was to block him, so I did so on everything. I thought that was going to be the end of it once again. I was off work that day because it was a weekend. I decided a few hours later to go get some lunch. As I walked out my front door, though, I was more than a little surprised and scared to see Todd's car waiting in the parking lot. I did my best to pretend like I hadn't noticed it and went to my own car. I got in and pulled out, and he immediately began following me. He wasn't even making an attempt to hide what he was doing. He was very blatantly stalking me. I was a bit scared now. Between his behavior on the date and the weird emails, I was sure he was going to try and do something. I made a lot of sharp turns trying to lose him, but he kept following me exactly. I'm not sure if you've ever had someone tail you in their car before, but it can be very, very frightening. At one point, still hoping I could lose him, I did get a bit ahead of him. Then I had a red light though. Maybe I should have run it, I don't know, but I just watched him in the rearview mirror. He wasn't attempting to stop at all. He was still going very fast. It was clear he was going to hit me. His car collided with mine at full speed and sent my car flying forward into the intersection. It scared the crap out of me. I was pressed back in my seat, and I actually thought I was going to die. A car that had the green light of the intersection was going in that moment, and it hit me dead on in the side, spinning me in the opposite direction. After spinning a few times, finally it was over. Even though Todd's car was badly damaged, he was able to drive away from the scene. The police came, and of course they eventually found and arrested him. He was charged with assault and hit and run. For the longest time, I had a problem driving. Every time I got into a car, I could still feel that accident happening and thinking I was going to die in that moment. Thank God I never saw him again. A lot of people who have either had good relationships or even those who've not been in relationships at all tend to think that Valentine's Day is just a really romantic holiday. I haven't seen it that way at all. I'm not bitter, mind you. It has more to do with the job I've worked for a long time. I've worked in a motel since I was 18 years old. And yeah, it was one of those types where people pay by the hour. It was sort of cool when I was 18 and just got the job. My friends all thought it was pretty neat I worked in a motel too. People were always hooking up all the time, and I did too. That faded the longer I worked there though. Of course, with a motel like that, you see a lot of hookers coming in and out. In the beginning, I was worried I would get into trouble for letting that happen. However, I soon got used to it. The day that I saw the most hookers in the motel was, of course, Valentine's Day. For me, when I think of Valentine's Day, I always think about two things: hookers and what happened to me a few years back on that day. I was working and I was the only one at the motel. It was quite busy, and there was this one woman named Tammy who frequented the area quite a lot. It wasn't unusual for her to have several stays in one day or evening. This day was no different. She knew me well and would often wink at me before she went to her room with her client. I guess during that day, on Valentine's Day, Tammy had been there about 3 times or so. I don't really think about it too much more than that. Each time it was with a different guy, of course. They would be in the room for less than an hour, and I watched them leave each time. The third time, however, I only noticed the John leaving. He didn't return the key either. I thought maybe Tammy might have had it, or maybe he just left it in the room after the hour they paid for was up. As I waited and waited though, Tammy still had not come out yet. I gave about an extra 30 minutes, and still there was no signs of life from the room. I would have to go there and check it out myself. This wasn't a thing that happened very often, so I was a bit apprehensive. I took my master key and made my way over to the room. The curtains were all drawn shut. At this point, my mind was creating all sorts of bizarre scenarios that I was expecting to happen when I opened that door. When I finally opened it up, the room was completely dark. I switched on the light, expecting to see Tammy on the bed or the floor, but she wasn't in the room. I sighed in relief, assuming she'd just left without me seeing her. Then, though, I noticed I heard water running. I remembered that I had to check the bathroom too. I walked over to the dark bathroom, opened the door, and flipped on the lights. There she was, beaten and bruised, laying face down in a bathtub full of water. Blood was all over the shower head and flowing down onto the floor. I checked really quick and was surprised to see that somehow she was still alive. I can't even explain how terrible she looked, and can only imagine the beating he must have given her. I turned the water off right away and let her know I was going to call 911. Apparently, this John was a guy who'd been regularly beating up hookers in the area. Tammy was not the first of them, and I don't think she was the last either. He paid with cash and hardly anyone used his real name, so I doubt they were able to track down the guy in the end. So yeah, whenever I think about Valentine's Day, I think about hookers and violence. I was living in the Fiji Islands back in 2016, and I was 14 years old. This story happened to my family, but mainly my mom lived through it. It was on the 31st of October, and I was at school for a Halloween-based party. My parents and my little sister were gone to a family friend's Halloween party as well, so the house was completely empty. My party finished at 9 p.m. My dad came to pick me up, but dropped off my mom and sister at the house, because our security alarm was ringing. Because nobody was home, my family obviously called the security company over, and they sent a van with 3 security guards. My mom opened the house and let everyone in to check the entire thing. They didn't find anyone. My mother checked all the cupboards and under the bed with my little sister, who was only 12 at the time. The security went outside in the garden and into the basement as well to make sure that there was no one there and it was not an accidental ring. My mom turned all the lights on from the living room and the balcony. She had just started to open the window and the gates that protect all the windows to get on the balcony when she looked at the keyhole. She noticed there was some flip-flops on the floor nearby. She then looked a bit closer and saw 2 pairs of legs hiding close to each other against the wall under a garden sofa. My mom yelled out of her lungs. The 2 guys got scared and jumped off the balcony into the gardens. One of the guards responded quickly and grabbed one of the men. The second intruder ambushed the guard though, and they ran away together, jumping over the fence and running off into the forest. My mother regretted in that moment yelling. If she'd come down and talked to the security quietly, the guys probably would have been caught right then and there. My mother was now crying, holding my sister to her side and telling her everything would be okay. The security officers then called the police. They did a report and described the guys, and a search was started. The cops were there very quickly. The guys who jumped had lost a hat and their flip-flops and left their socks and 2 knives behind as well. Sadly, the men were never found again. But 2 weeks later, my mom pulled out of the driveway and looked into the rearview mirror of her car. She was 90% sure the 2 guys standing there opposite our house were staring at her. The short one had the same kind of hat the robbers had left behind, and the other guy had a pair of brand new flip-flops. When my mom drove to the police station, the guys were long gone and never to be found again. My dad was mad that he didn't stay with my mom. I got home after that with my dad, to my mom and sister crying. My dad was mad he didn't stay, but my mom had drunk and could not drive. Luckily, my mom saw them before she opened the window. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened. Now, how did the 2 guys get onto the balcony in the first place? Well, it's going to sound stupid, but right next to the balcony where they were hiding, there were these 2 wooden poles linked to a weird plank thing. They weren't there for any specific purpose whatsoever. They were just kind of lying around. My dad had asked the landlord to get rid of them multiple times, but for whatever reason, the landlord refused to. So I guess that's how they managed to climb up onto the balcony. I'm now 21 and live in Australia, and even though I didn't live through this myself, it still really scared me. I always make sure to check the entirety of my house now, and make sure my house is always locked, to the point that sometimes I lock myself out of the house way too many times. I had this really weird experience that haunts me to this day. I had a great uncle who was around 80 years old. At the time, his wife had passed away a few months earlier. They had been together since they were in high school, so he was of course very devastated by the sudden loss. It's hard to say that my uncle withdrew from the world because he was already sort of withdrawn. He lived out in the hills in this beautiful old house he had built by himself. He was very handy and very rarely came down off the hill for any reason, at least after my aunt passed away. He spent about 5 months without even driving down into town or contacting anyone. My family was very concerned about him. My mother told me that when she went to see him, he specifically asked if I could come and stay with him for a while. I always enjoyed spending time with my uncle, so I readily agreed to the drive. His house was a long ways away. When I say he lived way out in the hills, he was really way far out there. I got to his house eventually though, and went in to see him. I was shocked to see just how much the man had aged. Not only that, but he also acted much differently now. He was extremely paranoid and refused to be left alone in the house. Literally, when he was ready to go to sleep, he would beg me to stay in the room with him. He was afraid to be alone. This was a big surprise to me because I had never known this man to be scared in his entire life. My uncle told me that ever since his wife had passed away, though, he'd been seeing a man dressed in black. The man would usually wait outside the house. He would always step out from behind a tree for a moment. Then, as soon as my uncle spotted him, he would move away again. He even told me that once or twice, he'd caught the man watching him through one of his windows, but whenever the man was caught watching, he would step away. Obviously, I thought my uncle was just losing it. He was understandably distraught about losing his wife, and clearly the stress was making him see things. However, whether the problem was real or not, I was more than willing to stay with him to make him feel better. About 2 weeks after I'd arrived, my uncle was in bed. I'd come into the room with him and waited on the chair while he slept. I decided I really needed to get up and stretch my legs a bit in that moment. My uncle was a really deep sleeper anyway, so the chances of him waking up at all and noticing I was gone were pretty damn slim. I got up and went to the kitchen. I decided to work quickly on making myself something to eat. While I was just finishing cooking something though, I suddenly heard this horrendous noise coming from my uncle's room. At first, it sounded like a scream, accompanied by a loud shattering sound. Completely freaked out, I dropped my food and sprinted to my uncle's bedroom as fast as I could. I'll never get the image of what I saw that night out of my head. My uncle was still laying down in bed, as white as a sheet. His eyes were open wide, and for a moment I almost thought he was dead. That's how still he was being. Even stranger still, though, was what he was staring at. He was staring at the window facing his bed. As I observed closer, I saw it had been completely shattered. There was glass all over the floor, and it was very evident that whatever destroyed this window had done so from the outside. I checked around the outside and inside of the house. I not only found nothing, I found no trace of anything being there at all. My uncle was terrified to be alone while I was checking the premises, but there was nothing I could do about it. I had to make sure no one was there still. After a thorough check, I still found nothing. I hated to do this to him, but I had to take my uncle off that hill. He was so scared, but whatever had happened to him made it even worse. I took him to the hospital to check up, but unfortunately his mental state had deteriorated from the attack so badly that he wouldn't be allowed to go back to the house. My mom arranged for him to be put into a home, and I repaired the damage to the window. Nothing was stolen when I got back. I stayed there for a while, but I never saw the man my uncle talked about. And no further vandalism ever happened there again. I have no idea what that was about, but it seemed to be targeting my uncle for some reason. I've told quite a few people this story, and almost no one believes me. It's most definitely true though, and is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. I had a few years where I was sort of down on my luck. I live in an area with a lot of my relatives. One of my aunts was having a party, and I ended up staying a lot later than I should have. There was free beer though, so I kind of had to. I got a bit intoxicated, and when my cousin, who was supposed to be driving me home, wanted to leave, I declined because I wanted to stay and keep drinking. He left on his own, and I was left without a ride home. When I finally felt it was time to leave, I had an extremely long and uncomfortable walk ahead of me. While you might think that my aunt or someone else could have given me a lift home, my family was a bit tired of having to drive me places. I prepared for this really long walk down this country road. Although I had been drinking, the atmosphere outside sobered me up pretty quickly. It was really dark and very brisk. For some strange reason, it was also eerily quiet this night. I mean, usually there are all sorts of animal noises, crickets, frogs, other things that bump in the night. But this time, everything was calm and completely silent. I did become aware of some noises further out into the woods though. As if an animal were walking around back there. The noises didn't go away either, which made me start to think that this animal might be following me. Of course, I was very nervous at this point. I didn't exactly fancy being someone's midnight snack. I tried to hurry it along a little bit. I did get slightly ahead of the noises, so I figured it would be okay from then on. Right then, though, I heard the sound of several twigs breaking. This sound stopped immediately after that. I had this feeling that whatever had been following me was now directly behind me and no longer moving. I told myself to keep moving forward. Part of me, though, said I just had to turn around and see what was going on. Very slowly, I forced myself to turn around. When I saw my pursuer, I screamed. There was a large figure in the dark, standing behind me. They had to be nearly 7 feet tall, and it almost seemed like their eyes were glowing red in the darkness. They stood there, staring down at me. I took off running right away, obviously. I was so terrified that I didn't even notice if they were following me. I didn't know how far I actually ran either, or if it followed me at all. After an eternity, though, I looked back and finally saw nothing was there. It was still eerily quiet, and I was still terrified, but I walked the rest of the way home. Now, I know everyone will just tell me that I was drunk, and I imagined this or something, but never before has drinking beer caused me to hallucinate someone in the dark. I know what I saw that night, and I never went for a walk in the middle of nowhere again because of it. Sometimes you have to be really careful how you interact with some people. I had a very messed up experience several years ago when I was on a long nature hike. I was just trying to get away from it all for a bit. I do that about once a year. It's mostly on a hiking trail that doesn't go very deep into the woods. I've never really been the type to want to get totally lost in the wilderness anyway, though. On this particular trip, on the second day of hiking, I set up my tent in an area I thought was ideal. It actually looked like it had been camped in before. That's actually the whole reason I chose it. I set up a fire and tried to relax a little bit after a long day of hiking. While I was in my tent, though, I suddenly saw a shadow of a very large man fall upon it. The man started slapping at the door of the tent, demanding I come out immediately. Confused, I went ahead and did so. There was an enormous, scary-looking man. He had a huge, scraggly beard and scars all over his forehead. I was definitely caught by surprise. The man started screaming at me for stealing his camping area. I was extremely surprised now. I told him I was sorry. It didn't really seem to me like anybody had been camping there recently. There wasn't a tent or even a trace of anyone there, other than signs of camping from a while ago. He didn't seem to care, though. He just went on and on. I was about to offer to pack up my stuff and find another spot. However, in the middle of yelling at me, this very strange man just wandered off into the woods still yelling. Obviously, I didn't sleep too well that night. I kept expecting the guy to come back, but he never appeared before me again. The following day, I went further on with my hike. I had mostly forgotten about the encounter by the time I came to this ravine. I had been to this area before. You had to cross a long rope bridge to get to the other side. I always hated that. The drop was extremely steep, and right into the river as well. I was always scared the bridge would suddenly collapse while I was on it. I mean, it didn't look rickety or anything, and it always held tight every time I crossed it before, but it still wasn't an easy thing to get over, especially because I've always had a problem with heights. Anyway, I began walking slowly and carefully across the bridge. I was probably a fourth of the way across when I suddenly felt it begin swaying strongly. It was so sudden I almost lost my balance and tumbled below, but I grabbed and held on. I wasn't sure why this was happening, but then I looked behind me. The huge man from the night before was right behind me. He wasn't walking after me though. He was standing on the bridge right on the edge and using all of his strength to make it sway. Surely he was hoping I would lose my balance and fall in. I guess he figured that if I lost my balance and I got hurt, having me fall off the bridge would make it seem like an accident. Feeling sick and scared, I realized I had to do my best to hold on and slowly make my way across the bridge. I was extremely frightened, and the bridge was swaying heavily. I got down to my hands and knees and crawled the rest of the way across. I had to keep looking back to see if the man was following me. He never did, though. He just continued to make the bridge sway back and forth and even tried to turn it upside down in an effort to get me to fall over. I had to stop about 3/4 of the way across to throw up. I almost lost my grip because of the retching, but I managed to hang on still. It was a nightmare, and I didn't think I was going to make it. My hands were slippery and losing grip. It wasn't until my feet were safely on the other side that I finally calmed down a bit. When I was able to get up, I looked back across the bridge. The huge man was already gone. When I didn't fall, I guess he went back into the woods. I just waited on that side of the bridge till more hikers came across. I explained to them what happened, and they escorted me back across the bridge. I reported the guy to the park rangers, but I have no idea what happened afterward, if anything did at all. I had to attend a family reunion a few years ago. Unfortunately, I really didn't have the money to fly, nor the money to stay in a hotel on the way there. Because of this, my plan was to drive the entire way and sleep at rest areas in my car. It made sense to me. It would ensure that I would be able to visit my relatives on this 3-day trip. I would be sleeping in the car for at least 2 nights. I brought along some pillows and blankets so I could curl up in the back seat. The first night came and went without incident. I found a rest area and was able to just hang out in the parking lot. The second day of driving, however, had me going through the mountains. I had never made this trip before, so I wasn't sure if I would even find a rest area on the way. I drove for a very long time, and when my eyes were beginning to close by themselves, I figured I would have to pull out on the side of the road to get a little rest. It was obviously much harder to go to sleep this time, but at least it was quiet and dark. Very few cars actually came across that road. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep before I felt something wake me up. I thought I felt my car moving a bit. Then I assumed it was probably just something I'd felt when I was sleeping. I closed my eyes, and then I felt it again. My car bobbed up and down a bit. I was afraid, peeking out from under the blankets. I caught sight of someone standing at the front of my car. He had his foot resting on the bumper, and he was pushing it down with his foot, causing my car to bob a bit. I was about to hide back under the blankets when I looked to the side window. I saw a second person there, peeking inside. I jumped up, and when I did, I saw the first guy leave the front of the car and come around to the side window where I was. He began slamming on my door and trying to open it. Fortunately, it was already locked. They started banging on my windows. I was completely freaked out at this point. I decided the best thing to do would be getting to the front seat and to drive off. Right before I started the car, though, the first guy succeeded in breaking in my window. I yelled and quickly pulled away. I have no clue why those guys were antagonizing me, but I did not stop driving until I got to the reunion. And obviously, I never slept outside at night again. At a really young age, my parents began letting me stay home alone. We were pretty poor at the time, so both had to work. I was given a key to the house, and whenever I would get home from school, I would get inside, lock the door, and wait for my parents to return home from work. I was never supposed to answer the door for anyone. I was 11 when this happened. I was walking home from school, and there was already a storm coming. The clouds were black and were slowly inching their way across the sky. I knew I'd have enough time to get home before it fully began pouring down, though. I did arrive, Although when I got home, it was already completely dark outside due to the cloud cover. It was only about 3:30 p.m. too. When the rain finally began falling, the winds were extremely heavy. The thunder and lightning were even worse than I could recall from any other time. Unlike many people, I never really liked storms, so I was pretty damn scared. About 4:30, I heard a sudden knock at the door. I was always instructed not to open the door for anyone, nor to let anyone know I was home alone. I ignored it because of this, but this was also the first time anyone had come knocking when I was alone anyway. I really didn't have experience handling this situation. When the knocking continued for a few minutes, and whoever it was didn't seem like they were giving up, I didn't know what to do. After a while, the stranger used their fingernails and opened the mail slot of the door. "Hey kid, I know you're in there. Your parents have been in a car accident due to the storm, and they sent me to come pick you up and take you to the hospital, okay?" I got up and walked to the hallway. I knew I was supposed to ignore this person, but I had it figured that something serious must have happened to my parents. I was very concerned. I stood a few feet away from the door, and I could see the man was crouching down, peeking in through the mail slot. He clearly saw me as he called out to me. "Come on, kid, both your parents are hurt real bad. Come on out so I can get you to the hospital before anything bad happens to him." In an 11-year-old's mind, you don't really know what to do with that information. I didn't respond. I just stood there stunned and wondered what I should do. I was worried about my parents, of course, but they'd also told me to never let anyone know I was home alone, nor to let anyone I didn't know into the house. "Come on, kid," the guy yelled this time, sounding angry and impatient. "If you don't come with me right now, your parents might die. You don't want your parents to die, do you?" Well, wrong move, buddy. One way to terrify me was to yell at me, so now I was terrified of the man. I ran away from the door, went up to my bedroom, and ran into the closet. I hid inside. I could still hear the man pounding on the door and screaming in through the mail slot. It lasted a while longer, but then I didn't hear anything else. I must have been hiding in the closet for nearly 2 hours, but it seemed like the man had gone away about an hour in. That was until I suddenly heard someone enter my bedroom. I nearly screamed when the doorknob turned and opened. There was my mom standing there, completely unharmed and wondering why I was hiding in the closet. I swiftly explained what happened, and that was the end of it. Although we don't know for sure it was him, a man was later arrested on several kidnappings in the area. My parents had never been hurt. This guy was just trying to get me to open the door and go with them. I was 11, and 11-year-olds can be quite gullible. Thank God we can be very scared of strangers too. I don't know exactly why it is, but it seems that people are much more likely to order delivery pizza when it's stormy outside. Snowstorms, thunderstorms, it doesn't really matter. I often joke that they make bets to see if the delivery drivers have a wreck or something in the bad weather. By far the weirdest delivery I ever had to make, though, happened during one of the nastiest thunderstorms I'd ever experienced. It was completely dark outside, except for when the white lightning lit up the entire sky. The outside winds had to be a good 40 miles per hour. At one point, I got an order for a pizza to be delivered to an address I had never been to before. I even remember the exact order to this day: 2 large half pepperoni, half mushrooms with black olives. When I walked out to my car with the box, the wind almost decided to take the pizza and deliver it for me. It was an extremely difficult drive. With the rain and the wind, the wipers were on full speed, and I still had nearly zero visibility. It took all my focus to keep driving straight. To make matters worse, though, when I finally arrived at the address of the house was completely dark. Now, this story happened in the 80s, before everyone paid for their pizza online. I quickly expected it to be a prank. Call the pizza delivery driver to go out in nasty weather to a random address. As I pulled into the driveway, though, I noticed someone was out on the porch in the darkness, rocking back and forth in a rocking chair. I found this quite odd. I left my car lights on and stepped out of the car. I suppose the lights were a bad idea, really. I ran up onto the porch to get out of the rain. It was only as I was wiping the rain out of my eyes that I realized this was not a real person sitting in this rocking chair. It was like a Halloween dummy or some sort of crypt keeper looking character. There was only rocking because of the fierce winds. There was a sign tied to it that said to bring the pizza around back. I wasn't about to do that, though. Instead, I walked over to the door and knocked on it. There was no answer, so I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I was about to knock for a third and final time when out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone peek around the corner of the house. Come on, bring the pizza around back. They disappeared out of sight once again, behind the side of the house. There were no lights at all, other than from my car. I honestly stood there with a dumb look on my face, before deciding what to do. Just as I was about to make a decision, though, I saw a hand wrap around and tap on the side of the house. Looking back, they beckoned me to them. This was way too weird. It was like something right out of a horror film. I took the pizza and hurried back to my car. I slammed the door. Right when I began to pull out, 4 huge guys rushed out from the side of the house. "Hey, he's leaving!" one of them yelled. They came rushing towards the car. I was already in, though, and this was not a horror movie, so I was able to start the car and pull away from them quite easily. I heard a crashing sound as I was leaving, though. Something hit my back window and shattered it in. I put the pedal to the metal and got out of there as fast as I could. My initial thoughts had been that this was a prank. However, I thought differently when they broke my back window. I reported the event to the police. Apparently, an old senior couple was supposed to live in that house, but they were currently on vacation. The house had not been broken into either. I'll never really know what those guys were up to for sure, and maybe it's better that way. I know a lot of people have a neighbor or at least someone who lives in their neighborhood that's quite a bit weird. When I was growing up, there was this one guy who lived down the block that just always gave me the creeps. The kids all had their stories about him. Also, as an adult, I'd like to think that the stories weren't true, but some of the strange things I'd seen this man do made it hard for me to believe they were fake either. Just to give you a few examples, several times I'd see him flying a kite in the middle of the night, just running up and down the middle of the street at midnight, trying to get his kite up in the air with no wind. It always seemed so odd to me. He'd also just watch people. I know some people like to sit on their porches and watch as people go by, but this guy took it a big step further. If you happened to be walking by the sidewalk in front of his house, his eyes and head would follow you. Then, once you passed by, he'd get up off the porch, walk down to the sidewalk, and follow you all the way until you turned onto another street. Then he'd stay at that street corner, watching you walk away. He'd never follow you after that first turn, though. It was just extremely strange. My weirdest experience with him happened when I was 16 years old. I'd been staying over at my friend Chuck's house, playing video games. We'd of course lost track of time. It was about midnight or so when I saw a streak of lightning light up the sky. Of course, it was followed by the loud bang of thunder. I realized I was going to have to try and get home before the rain started pouring down. My parents had long since gone to bed. My friend's parents weren't exactly too keen on others spending the night there either. It wasn't too long after I'd set out on my way that it began raining too. It was light at first, just enough to make me worry, but then it began raining harder and harder. I decided that if I continued like this, I was going to get soaked and maybe even end up sick at the end of the day. I might as well try to not let it bother me though. It's not like I could turn around and go back. Of course, on the way there, I walked by that strange old man's house like usual. To my surprise, he was actually sitting on the porch, even though it was so late, and pouring like hell. Like usual, he never took his eyes off me while I walked by, but he did surprise me when he jumped off his porch without an umbrella or anything, and began following me through the pouring rain. I was already on edge about the storm, and this was just making it so much worse. I tried to ignore his presence behind me, and figured that once I turned the street he would stop following me like always. The anxiety caused by the loud and booming lightning, though, really didn't lend itself to me feeling relaxed at all. I turned down my street, and after going a little ways down, I snuck a peek back over my shoulder. I was extremely surprised to see that the man was still following me down my own street. From there, I started running, and I didn't look back again. I just wanted to get to my house and out of the rain and away from this strange man. The problem with running in the rain, however, is of course that the ground is very slippery. I tried to cut through my yard, but I slipped on some mud and went crashing head first into the ground. I groaned for a moment, and that groan quickly became a cry when I felt the hands of the man grab me from behind. He flipped me over onto my back and began punching me in the face hard. "Stay the hell off my street!" he began screaming over and over into my face. He had these long, ragged fingernails, and they were scratching deep gashes into my face as he hit me. I didn't know what else to do other than scream for help. I don't know if it was my screams or the cracks of thunder that woke my father up, but he rushed out of the house, saw what was going on, and ran to grab the guy off me. The man kept screaming that I was on his street and to keep me off his damn street. The police arrested the guy, and I had to go to the emergency room. The man was found mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric hospital. I never saw him again after, at least not for real, but every time a thunderstorm passed through my area, I could see his face in my mind. I was listening to some scary stories about drives down country roads, and I decided to share mine as well. One thing I've noticed in these stories, which has tended to be true of my own experiences driving down these roads, is that often they are very narrow, and sometimes you have to drive an extremely long way before you're able to find anywhere to turn around. Some rural roads I've been on have gone on for miles without coming to a driveway or any other turning point. I doubt that people who've not experienced driving on these roads would likely even believe that they exist. However, I've lived in areas where the dirt roads wind almost endlessly up into the hills. I had my own scary experience when I was just 13 years old. Yeah, I know what you're thinking right now. Why would a 13-year-old be driving a car in the first place? But where I grew up, that wasn't unusual. This was in the early 1970s. I'll tell you that my mom learned to drive when she was just 11. You weren't exactly going to come across police in waiting on these types of roads. So why did the driver's license even really matter, especially when there weren't going to be other people around on the road usually anyway? The police and everyone basically knew around here, but they weren't too likely to give you a ticket. Everyone was driving before they were old enough. When you turned off the main road onto the dirt road that led to my house, there was a really small convenience store there. My dad often sent me off to get some beer for him. Yeah, the store owner was also my aunt, and she knew I was getting it for my dad, so she always gave me the beer. I picked up the beer pretty quickly. I think my dad was probably pretty drunk as it was, though. I thought I'd take the car and go driving a little while myself, so I drove out onto the main road for a while. Then I turned off onto a country road I'd never been on before. It was pretty fun for me to do this, find new places and explore areas I'd never been to. I thought the country road I lived on was small, but this one was barely large enough to fit the car on the road. The woods were really thick all around, and the further I went down this road, the more and more the road seemed to narrow. It seemed like the trees were almost converging onto the road, and more than once near the ending, a branch from a tree scraped against the window of my car as I drove along. This was extremely frustrating. I had to drive very slowly because of all the twists and turns in it. What the hell was I even supposed to do if another car came down the road? There was barely enough room to fit on the road, let alone room to turn. I had this horrible thought as well, that perhaps this road didn't lead anywhere at all. What would I do if it dead-ended? What if it used to lead to somewhere, but the forest had long since overgrown it? Worst of all, what if it led to somewhere that someone didn't want me to be? My dad had always told me that deep out in these hills, there were people you never wanted to meet up with. I didn't come across any other cars, but I did eventually come to a driveway. The problem, however, was that this driveway was gated off. I didn't see a house anywhere around either. I guess this could have just been a side road that led off to somewhere out on the hill, but it was either continue driving down the road I was already on, or find some way to use this driveway/side road to turn around. I nervously got out of the car. The gate was not locked, but it did have a bolt in it. I undid the bolt and opened the gate up. I kept looking around me, trying to see if anyone else was around. If they discovered what I was doing, who knows what would happen. I was getting into my car and turned around. I got my car out of the gate. I guess I should have just gone straight home, but I felt that I should at least go out and close it behind me. My car was now facing the opposite direction, so the only light I had to see by was my tail lights. I still felt obligated to shut it though. I got out and went over to close this gate. When I wrapped my hand around the bars though, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun cocking. I had fired enough of them to know what that sounded like. I looked up, and by the meager red light of my taillights, I noticed someone standing not too far away. The red light made them look extremely intimidating, and they were definitely holding a gun. I watched them lower the gun and point it right at me. A lot of people instantly freeze when a gun is pointed at them. I didn't though. I let go of the gate and ran back to the car. No sooner than I'd slammed the door closed, did I hear a shotgun blast ring out. Miraculously, it didn't hit me though. I took off as fast as I could down the narrow and dark road. The ride back home was terrifying, even scarier than it had been on the way there. I didn't calm down till I was back on the paved road and headed back to my own home. I told my dad what happened honestly. He was more upset it took me so long to get him his beer though. I grew up out in the country. My family was from a really low-income area, and most of us were on welfare. We had food stamps too. Even when I was young, so many of my relatives were always not working. It really wasn't until I was much older, but I realized it was normal for people to actually have a job. The world's a much different place now. I started chewing tobacco and even drinking beer around the age of 14. It didn't seem that weird to me, because everyone else was doing it too. I also started hanging out at my friends' houses and doing the same there. A lot of times I hung out at my friend Brandon's house. He lived out on the same ridge as I did. My mom had given me a ride to his place on this particular night, but it wasn't unusual for me to walk back and forth. It was easily a 5-mile walk through the hills, along a gravel road. I'd walked it both in the day and in the night. This happened on a night where me and my buddies were all hanging out at Brandon's house in his basement, drinking beer and playing video games. Of course, back then it was the Atari 2600. I actually ended up getting pretty damn drunk that night, and that was my downfall. Actually, normally I would get drunk, pass out, and then go home the next day. But on this night, me and Brandon got into a stupid drunken fight. I got angry at him and stormed out of his house at 2 a.m. Being drunk, I stayed angry for quite a while as well. By the time I'd finally begun to get over it though, I was too embarrassed to just go back to his house. I decided the best thing to do was continue walking home. It was a pretty hot summer night. Thank God the wind was blowing really hard. It probably kept me from working up too much of sweat and overheating that night. It might have been the alcohol or something, but I was getting a bit nervous for some reason as I was walking home. It was a really creepy night, like something from a movie. The sky was overcast, but there was a full moon, and the clouds were moving fast. They'd cover and uncover the moon quickly. Most houses on the ridge were set on the hills. They were all dark when I came by them. There were also some older abandoned small buildings closer to the road. If you've ever driven down an old country road, you've probably seen a rather degraded small building. I was approaching one of them. It was a few yards off the road, a building I'd seen and passed by many times without incident. Only this time, there was something different. There was a light on inside it. I had just seen the light on in the house, and it made me extremely apprehensive as I was walking down the road. If someone was inside doing something in that house, they were close enough by the road to see me walking by. It was near 3 a.m. by that time. I couldn't imagine what they were doing in this abandoned building in the middle of the country. I couldn't imagine it was anything good either. I tried to walk further to the far side of the road and did my best to hide away in the darkness, walking quietly past the building. I really didn't want to get the attention of the person in that shack. I was quite curious about what may have been going on inside though. As the shack got closer and closer, I still couldn't make out anyone inside the building from where I was. I'd actually walked off the side of the road now, into the grass to slightly conceal myself. I kept on glancing passing by. I saw movement in the building. I was about to get a closer look when I heard the most horrifying and blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard in my entire life. It nearly knocked me off my feet in surprise. Then I saw two of the biggest, scariest-looking country boys I'd ever seen. They passed by the window, and I thought I saw one of them look out at me. I wasn't sure if he'd actually seen me though. I just ran and took off down the street. I had never been so scared in my life. I couldn't look back because I knew if I did, I would see those guys running right after me. I just kept running until my sides began cramping. I kept running until my feet hurt, and I still kept running. I ran until I made it home and immediately threw up in the yard. I don't know what I witnessed that night. I don't want to know. I never walked past that building again at night. I did walk past it during the day. Several times I wanted to go inside and see if anything was still in there, but I never did. I was too scared and horrified of what I might find. I was pretty excited when I finally got my driver's license. My family was great too, and they bought me a new car as soon as I did. Of course, I took full advantage of this and drove all over the place whenever I could. It was a convertible Mustang, and it got me a lot of popularity in school. Everyone was wanting to go for a ride. Unfortunately though, this car also got me the ire of this guy named Billy. He had never really liked me much. My dad was a doctor and my mom was a writer. We did have things pretty comfortable, and his family was less well off. He seemed to hold that against me in particular for some reason, so when I got this new car, it made him dislike me even more. He had a car too, but I guess he was angry with me that it was a beater with a heater, as people called it. I never made fun of him or anything like that though. Hell, it was a nice car, and the point of a car is to get you somewhere anyway, but he still resented me for whatever reason. One night after a high school football game, I decided to take a few friends home before heading home myself. When I left the school, I noticed Billy's car pull out behind me. I didn't really think about it too much though. I did keep an eye on it just to make sure, as I dropped off two of my friends in town. He'd followed me the entire way. When I stopped to let them out, he stopped right behind me. When I started to back up, he followed me there as well. Billy made absolutely no bones about the fact he was following me. It was almost as if he wanted me to know this. The third friend of mine lived a bit further out of town, on a rural road. It was a pretty far out drive, so it was going to take a while to get my buddy home. Sure enough, when we pulled out onto the route, Billy followed close behind me. It was nerve-wracking. I hadn't even thought about calling the police earlier. At this time, I thought it was probably too late. I wasn't going to get any bars at all that far out into the country. Billy followed us really closely too. It was really scary, because the curves on the road were pretty wild. Many times I was scared to hit the brakes at all, because he would have rear-ended me with how close he was, and sent me flying over the edge. I was actually a bit surprised he hadn't done that on purpose yet. He was clearly up to no good, either trying to scare us, or sincerely wanting to hurt me. Fortunately for me, though, I was driving a brand new Mustang. My friend had a long driveway up to his house, you see, so the moment I turned into it, I floored it down the driveway and left Billy in the dust. We got to the house and ran out of the car inside. Before he was able to make it all the way up the driveway, I wasn't really sure what to do now. We all had to agree whether or not to call the police. I mean, sure, he was following us, but he hadn't done anything yet. When I watched him hop out of his car, though, and walk towards mine, I told my buddy to call the cops right now. I wasn't sure what Billy was doing, but I was sure it couldn't be anything good. I didn't figure out what it was until I saw him light a match and throw it on my car. My car was instantly caught on fire. I found out later that while we were rushing inside, he'd poured gasoline all over it. My friend's dad went upstairs and grabbed his rifle while my friend called 911. By the time my friend's dad got outside, though, Billy was in his car, leaving. I wanted to put the car fire out, but his dad told me not to go anywhere near it and get back inside the house. Billy's fire was only on the top of my car, luckily. It destroyed the paint job, the convertible top, and the interior, and burnt the hell out of the frame. But the fire went out before reaching the engine or any flammable liquids. If Billy had wanted the car to explode, he didn't do a very good job of where he'd placed the gasoline. The last time I ever saw Billy was in court. He was being sentenced. His petty attitude really screwed up his life pretty badly. I also had full coverage insurance, so when you look at his actions, he gained nothing by being a jackass to me. He went to jail, and I got my car fixed in the end. Oh well, I guess that's how it turns out sometimes. I don't really want to tell you what area I live in. I guess no one will really do anything with it, but it still makes me a bit paranoid. It will suffice to say that I grew up in a nice traditional country town, and there were a lot of nice country roads in the area. Some of them were a bit notorious for being makeout spots for teenagers. My girlfriend at the time lived in a really nice old house out of town. Her family was quite wealthy, and their home almost looked like a plantation. I had to drive out of town down a country road for a bit in order to make it to her place. Along that road is an old covered bridge. I've never really liked driving across it though. It was very creepy, and I was always worried the old thing would fall apart on me. The worst part was just how creepy it was. I had a horrible experience on that bridge once. I had been out late on a date with my girlfriend, and by the time I got her back home, her entire family was already asleep. I had to quietly drop her off before heading home myself. On my way back towards town, my car began to make some strange noises, and before I knew it, it turned off altogether. I had to twist the wheel in an effort to get it off the road. I tried to use my cell phone to call for help, but I couldn't get a signal in this area. I didn't know the first thing about fixing this sort of issue in a car, so I had to decide what was better, trying to walk back to my girlfriend's house or walking back towards town. Since my girlfriend's family was already asleep though, I opted to head back towards town. I began the long walk there. It was extremely creepy, and it was a very still night. Only very seldom was there even a slight breeze. The moon was the only source of light out there. Although it was just enough to walk, it really wasn't that great at viewing the surroundings. I didn't normally find myself getting scared of the dark or anything like that, but at this time I was definitely a little apprehensive. Those backcountry roads can be a whole lot scarier than city roads at night. Eventually, I came upon the bridge. I had forgotten all about it in my worry because I'd been so concerned about my car. If I had thought it was dark along the road though, that was nothing compared to the pitch black facing me inside this covered bridge. I was hesitant to walk inside as I couldn't see anything in there. I couldn't exactly go around though. It was over a large creek, and I had no plans of going swimming that night. When I got up to the entrance of the bridge, I hesitated for a long time. I don't know exactly how long I stood there, dreading having to walk into that darkness. Like jumping into a cold swimming pool though, I realized if I just got it over with, that would be so much better. I walked slowly into the bridge. It was dark. I know I keep saying that, but I mean it was so dark that I put my hand up in front of my face, and I couldn't even see it right next to me. I could see some tiny light coming from the opening ahead. All I could hear was the creaking sounds of my feet as they pressed down on the old wooden boards. I kept my eyes focused on the other end, and I knew I would be there quickly. Suddenly though, at the opening of the opposite side of the bridge, a dark figure walked in and blotted out the light. I stopped, suddenly surprised that anyone else was out here at this time. As I stopped walking though, the creaking sounds of the boards did not stop. Someone was walking behind me too. I instinctively turned around. I couldn't imagine these two people were up to anything good. I couldn't see the person behind me at all, so I decided to try and run for the opening. I could see the figure of the man standing there just barely. Before I could even begin, however, a person grabbed me from behind and shoved me head first into the wall of the bridge. I felt a bunch of hits on the back of my head before I blacked out altogether. When I woke up, I had the worst headache I ever imagined. I was still laying in the bridge, and my head was throbbing. I could feel blood pouring down the back of my head, and when I tried rubbing the painful spot, I could tell whoever had attacked me had taken all of my clothes. I got up, swaying a bit, and began walking awkwardly toward the portal of the bridge. I got out of it and saw that I was indeed completely stripped and bloody all over. I had only taken a few steps out of the bridge when I collapsed once again. Next thing I remember, I was in a hospital bed. Apparently, I'd been laying outside on the bridge bleeding all night until my girlfriend's father had to drive to town for work. He saw me lying there and rushed me to the hospital. I never found out who it was that attacked me. I guess it could have just been a simple mugging. I didn't exactly have any enemies I could think of that would plan this sort of thing out. In the future though, even driving across that bridge was a terrifying experience. There's a small covered bridge that leads into a historic downtown area, not far from where I live. Ironically, the bridge itself was built much more recently, and there's nothing historic about it. I don't know, I just always thought that was sort of funny. Anyway, my story takes place pretty late at night. Like a lot of historic towns that rely completely on tourism for their economy, this town closed down really early in the evening. From that point on, it was basically a ghost town. After 5 p.m., you couldn't find a single shop still open. I was trying to start up a YouTube channel of my own at the time, and I wanted to record exploration of abandoned areas. I figured I could film around this town when it was closed down, and I could pretend like it was a complete ghost town. I set up to do this on a Wednesday night. I figured it was better than doing it on a weekend. I drove into the town, and as usual, it was completely dead. I got my camera out. I took quite a bit of film that night. Of course, I didn't encounter anything like ghosts or anything spooky like that, but I really hadn't been expecting to either. I could just add in all the suspenseful stuff in editing. I was about to leave the town when I remembered that covered bridge. Those things have a reputation for being pretty creepy, so I decided to have a go and film around that area. The town was pretty small, so rather than drive out to the bridge, I decided to simply walk over to it. I thought maybe I could get some creepy footage along the way there. The bridge did not disappoint at all. It was extremely creepy. It was pretty small, like I mentioned. It was really more there as a decoration than anything. I started recording around that area. There were a lot of trees around, and I was thinking it might be cool to edit something into the video, like an orb or some other sort of mysterious ghost. Yeah, I know that's pretty dishonest, but at least I'm being honest now about what my intentions for my channel were. After filming around the bridge, I began walking up to it. I wanted to get a good shot of me walking through that bridge, so I began walking into it. As I mentioned, it was very short and covered a small gap of the road. There weren't any lights on the inside, though. That wasn't a big deal. It wasn't so dark that you couldn't see at all, and I had the light from my camera too. I was able to record the details of the bridge really well. As I was getting close to the far side, I was only a few steps away when I heard a voice whisper mid-step, "Hey, he's almost here. Give me the axe." Although it was a whisper, it was completely quiet outside, so I heard that conversation plain as day. I immediately stopped walking, and I heard some rustling by the bridge opening. I saw the beginning of a figure moving into the light. I turned and forgot about my video. I ran out of the other side of the bridge. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to know who was following me or what they wanted from me. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop running until I made it to my car. I finally turned to see if the person had been following me, but there was no one there. Still scared, I jumped into my car and made the drive out of town. There's no real telling what might have happened that night if I hadn't heard that conversation. I accept the fact it might have been some teenagers messing with me or something non-life-threatening. I mean, no one followed me, at least from what I could tell. But there's a slight possibility that there really were two people out there waiting for me with an axe to kill me. That possibility gets to me every time I think about it. Now, I don't really believe in ghosts, but I've never been able to explain this story in any way logically. I saw something that was quite frightening at an old covered bridge. The bridge was way up in the hills. You have to cross it on your way up to a cabin my family owns out there. The bridge itself is very old and rickety as well. It's also over a thin but very deep ravine. Even though I've crossed it so many times before, every time I get so much more nervous about it than I was the last time. It always creaks as my car crosses it, and I swear it feels like it's about to give way. But I've been going across that same bridge since I was 5 years old. It's always felt like that, and it's always held in place. This particular story happened in the early fall. I wanted to spend some time up at my family's cabin because the mountains were beautiful in the fall time. It was great watching the leaves turn the hills into different colors. My favorite thing about the leaves that fell from the trees was that it always kicked up a leaf storm as well. It was an extremely beautiful sight. I'd been up at the cabin all weekend, and on Sunday evening, I had to drive to the town in order to get something from the store. As you might imagine, I was not really enthusiastic about driving down these mountain roads at evening or night. I had to drive really slow and really carefully. As I was driving, I came around the corner and realized this was the corner with the covered bridge. I could see it up in the distance. I was pretty focused on what I was doing, and I wasn't really concerned with the structure of the bridge like I normally was. It wasn't completely dark out yet, so when the bridge first came into sight, I could have sworn I saw a person standing inside of it. It looked like they'd entered the bridge from the near side and were walking through it. I thought that was a bit weird, and that possibly I should offer them a ride. When I came closer to the bridge and got to the entrance of it, I saw there was indeed a person walking through the center. When I got there, he had stopped on the far entrance. He turned around and looked at me, blocking the exit. He looked right at my car, and my previous intentions of offering a ride slipped my mind in that moment. This was a bit of a scary-looking guy. He also had this huge smile on his face. I had to stop my car where it was. There wasn't any way to get past him without running him over. The bridge was only one thin lane. As I stopped there, I began to wonder what I should do. The man then started taking steps toward me though. He was still smiling. The way he walked was so creepy too. About halfway through the bridge toward me, he stopped. I'll never forget the creepy look on his face as he stood there for a moment, tilting his head and staring in at me. I wasn't sure how much time had passed with him standing there blocking the way. Then though, he suddenly walked to the side of the bridge. He pushed himself up on one of the openings on the side, turned back and smiled at me again, then just jumped off the side of the bridge into the ravine. Needless to say, I was shocked. Like an idiot, I jumped out of the car and ran to where he'd just been. There wasn't anything I could do though. By the time I got there, he must have hit the bottom of the ravine and died already. I looked down towards the bottom, but I didn't see anything. That was not surprising in and of itself. It was a very deep area. I didn't know what to do. I don't know how long I stood there, looking down into that ravine. When I realized I still had to drive to town, only now I had to drive to contact the authorities. I went straight to the police station and told them the entire story. The police officer I spoke to seemed very disinterested. When I was done though, he looked right at me and asked me a bunch of weird questions. Finally, he told me he could go down to the ravine and look for the body, but he knew that he would not find it. He said for the past 10 years he'd had people coming down off that mountain every once in a while, telling him that exact same story, but no one had ever been found in the ravine. I don't really know what to think of this. Was he just trying to keep me from following up, or was he serious about the amount of people who told him that story before? I don't know the exact truth, but I do know that what I saw that night was terrifying. I have a bad habit of walking alone at night. I love it though. I know it's not the best plan as a small woman, but it's one of those things that just gives me joy. Speaks to my soul, I guess, as cheesy as that may sound. I do carry pepper spray and keep my phone in my hand. But hell if I'll let fear ruin something I love. Summer nights are the best really. The light lingers forever in the Pacific Northwest. You get these endless twilights, and there's this beautiful breath of coolness coming out of the dense green, even when it's been hot in the daytime. I lived in the desert as a teenager, so I just love the cool, silky feeling air here. Soaking up that night air is amazing. I live in a small town at the head of a very long rural trail that winds through lowland marshy areas, dense woods, fields, and at night is silent and isolated. 99% of the time, nobody is out there in the night except for me, the bats, and a rare bicyclist. Once you get outside the city limits about a mile, there's nobody to fuck with you. There's nobody looking to fuck with you either, if you get my meaning. The only houses are sparse and far, across ravines and fields covered with blackberry cane. No streetlights and no easy exit from the trail either. I put one headphone in and walked for hours and miles. I usually take a big crossbody purse with some water, my ID, and a little cash, and start while the light is just leaving the sky. I only use my phone light when it gets pitch dark. This night, I was really far out into the boonies, just me and the maple trees. It was fully dark, really, really deep dark then. I was cruising along listening to a podcast in one ear, with my phone light lighting up the way. A beautiful night, just soaking it in. I'd been out there for a few hours and was now heading back. Suddenly, though, there was like this extra black patch, a big splotch of darkness moving across the trail. It took me a second to realize that's not a trick of the light. There actually was something there. There was a black mass blocking the trail in front of me. I started to get the chills. This was not normal, and this thing was between me and my home. There was no other choice, so I slowly crept up to whatever this was, and I noticed a black puddle. As I got closer, I started to make out that these were smears of blood. Not like a ton, but this was definitely blood on this paved trail. I walked closer and queued up 911 on my phone. The shadow resolved itself into a man in a big flappy black coat, now sprawled across the whole trail and surrounded by bloodstains. "Hey, are you okay?" To my surprise, the guy sat up. He was grimy, incoherent, and kind of chipper. "Oh, I'm okay. I'm just resting. You got any water?" I forked over my water bottle and told him to go ahead and keep it. He took it and thanked me, said he'd scraped his foot and wandered around a bit before deciding to take a breather, which was where the blood was from. I recognized him though. He was a local meth head. I asked him if I should call anyone, 911 or whatever. He didn't respond and just looked at me. I carefully skirted around him and quickly hurried back home. I did not have particularly warm and cozy feelings about him, having hosed off his puke from my porch multiple times. And I'd been called the see ya next Tuesday word more than once by him, so I decided to leave it at that. A few days later, he attacked a random tourist with a machete downtown in broad daylight, nearly sliced their leg off and went to prison, so I guess I had a fortunate encounter that night. One of my favorite hobbies is going out and exploring old abandoned buildings. Of course, that sort of thing just breeds scary stories. I used to explore in more urban areas, but they're not nearly as fascinating as old rural buildings. I belong to several groups that like to explore these sorts of old areas. Members would often suggest to others the locations of cool abandoned buildings, so they can be further explored and experienced. The strangest thing I ever explored was not actually a building though. This occurred in a rural area in Maine. The area is actually very good for exploring, as there are tons of abandoned barns and all sorts of old buildings out there. I was looking for one of these old barns when I lost track of where I was. I'm not sure how much you know about Maine, but it has a very large amount of forested area. It's definitely not the kind of place you want to get lost in. I'd also never really gotten lost like this before, at least not as significantly as I was that day. As I wandered around the woods, I thought my main goal should be trying to locate this particular barn. I knew the way to get there, so arguably if I found it, I should be able to deduce my way back out of the woods from there. I didn't find it as I was wandering though. I found something even stranger. I found what appeared to be a set of random old cellar doors. There was no building or even an old foundation around, as far as I could tell. It was just a random pair of cellar doors set in the ground. I began thinking that maybe me getting lost was a good thing. When I did get out of here, I would have a good story to tell all the others. I could see right away there were no locks on the doors. For some reason, they were a bit hard to get open though. When I finally did, I was surprised they didn't fall apart altogether. The steps led down into a really dark and dank area that I couldn't see in at all. I took out my flashlight and slowly entered this cellar. Walking down those stairs was quite a freaky experience. They creaked and bent under every step from my weight. I had no idea where they were leading, other than to an underground area. The cellar was quite interesting. I can't even really begin to describe it. It had an earthen floor, wooden support beams, and shelves made up the majority of the walls. Surprisingly, there was even an old bed laid up against one of them. There was also a table that was cluttered with various objects. Walking over to the table, I soon got the shock of my life. There were two things laying on top I would have never expected. One thing was the decayed remains of what was clearly a human hand. That was freaky enough, but the far scarier thing was a newspaper that was dated from only 3 days ago. That meant that not only was someone keeping a decaying human hand around, but they had recently been in that cellar. Shocked, I immediately went back to the stairs and tried to make my way out of that area. I almost expected one of the weak stairs to break under my weight as I hurried back up the steps. I got to the top and looked all around to see if anyone was watching. I quietly closed the door and hurried back into the woods as quickly as I could. The walk back was very nerve-wracking. I know it's cliché to tell you this, but I thought every sound I heard was the inhabitant of that cellar coming back. I had no idea if they were directly responsible for whatever events led to someone losing their hand, but I certainly didn't want to stick around to find out. It took me 2 hours to find my way back to my vehicle. It was completely dark by the time I got there. I was so on edge that I had to check the back seat of my car for intruders. I even looked under my car. That's how unnerved I was. That was the last time I ever went exploring in that area. My parents bought an old house when I was 10 years old. My dad had gotten a really good job and wanted to buy a bigger place for us to move into. The house was quite huge. It was old as well, but kept in a really good condition. It was so big that all of us kids even got our own room. We had a huge attic to keep all of our storage. In this house was also a very large and dark basement. It was completely empty though. The really interesting thing about the basement though was a small door located on one of the walls. It was locked when we moved in, and my dad had never been given a key for it. We had no way to open it. That little door became something of a fascination for me, my brothers, and my sisters. My dad tried to tell us, don't let your imaginations run wild now. He said it was likely just a small room that had tools in it, or maybe it had nothing at all. Yeah, telling us not to let our imaginations run wild, that pretty much just ensured that was the very thing that was going to happen. Growing up, we all used to tell all sorts of stories about what could possibly be behind this mystery door. My brother said it was a room that children would hide in when their parents were angry and fighting, like some sort of child panic room. The others all had their own ideas about what it could have been, but I don't want to bore you with all that. From age 10 to 16, I would have never considered trying to break down the door or trying to pick the lock or anything. I wasn't scared of my dad, but I knew that if I broke into it after he repeatedly insisted we don't, he would be pretty angry with me and I'd get in a lot of trouble. It was when I was 17 and I was home alone that I finally found out what was in that room. My family was all out of town, and I had a few friends over. After a lot of horsing around, my buddy began talking about the door. We all got really curious, and he kept insisting I try and get it open. I refused at first, telling him my dad would get very angry with me. When that didn't work, I told him the door was much more interesting when we didn't know what was really in there. That didn't work either. None of my excuses seemed to faze my friends, and I had to admit, I really wanted to know what was on the other side. We all snatched up some tools and decided to go open it up ourselves. I won't go into too much detail explaining how we did it, although it did take quite a long time to get through. Finally, though, we did get to the other side, where I saw the weirdest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was an extremely small room. I mean, I would have been too big at that age to even fit into myself. There was no lighting, so I had to use a flashlight to see around. There were what seemed to be words scrawled all over the walls. They were smeared with either blood or red paint. I told myself it was red paint. However, the decaying corpses of several birds and small animals were laying in a disgusting pile in the corner of this small room. That indicated that maybe these red smears on the wall could be bird blood. The weirdest thing, though, was there was a small child-sized rocking chair facing the far wall of the tiny room. There appeared to be a doll on the chair. Turning the chair around, I saw the doll was covered with what I assumed to be bird crap. Its eyes had been ripped out of their sockets, and they had been filled with blood that had long since dried. It had scratches on its face and rips in its clothes. It was missing both of its legs, below where the knees should have been. It was a freaky thing and pretty damn weird to just stumble upon. I didn't take anything out of the room. I closed and relocked the door because I didn't want my dad to get angry at me for opening it. That discovery created so many questions, though, that to this day I have no answers to. The weirdest thing of all was it made me more uncomfortable than I had been previously when I had no idea what was behind that door. I remember growing up in the 1980s and having things so different than they are right now. My family didn't even have air conditioning back then. It seems so basic nowadays. There also wasn't as much to do inside. There wasn't a proliferation of video games or movies or TV shows. I think about 5 people in the entire world had the internet back then. Summer vacations were often very dull because of this, and always pretty hot and sweaty too. When I was 13 years old, I began hanging out with a guy named Jack. He was a bit more daring than I ever was. One night, we were deep into summer break and watching some movies on our newfangled VCR or whatever it was called, as well as completely sweating our butts off. On this hot summer night, Jack had a sudden idea. He thought the two of us could go down to the local swimming pool, hop over the gate, and cool off inside. While I didn't really enjoy the idea of trespassing, it wasn't too difficult for him to convince me. It was about midnight when we finally arrived at the pool. It was completely dark out, and the fence surrounding the pool was decently high. It wasn't anything a couple of teenage boys would have a problem figuring out, though. Jack and I quickly scaled the fence and set ourselves down in the pool area. Our local pool had a tendency to get very busy during the day, so having it all to ourselves was quite a surreal experience. We were already in our swimsuits, so we quickly jumped into the water. It felt so much better than I can even begin to explain. Jack and I had a lot of fun at the pool. We did cannonballs, blasted a lot of water around, and just had a great time. After a while, I dared Jack to do something that neither of us had ever had the courage to do. I dared him to jump off the highest diving board. I could kind of tell he didn't really want to, but as I mentioned, Jack was more of the adventurous type than me. He eventually gave in with pressure, and I stayed at the opposite end of the pool. My back was to the pool building, where the showers were, and the entrance to the pool as well. Jack slowly climbed up to the top of the ladder. He was watching his feet the entire time, not really looking in my direction. I could tell he was scared going up there, but he was trying his best not to let on. Once he got to the top, he slowly began walking out on the board again. His eyes were constantly on his feet, and he wasn't really paying attention to me at all. It wasn't until I yelled at him, daring him to just do it, that he finally looked up from his feet and over at me. It was hard telling from such a distance, but Jack suddenly looked very alarmed and almost downright scared. He made a motion towards me, but then slipped on the board and fell into the water. Fortunately, he fell forward and didn't hit any part of his body on the pool's edge. He did hit the water pretty hard, though. I immediately began swimming for my friend. He didn't resurface very quickly, but fortunately for him, I was the best swimmer I knew. I dived down and found him struggling to swim back to the surface. I grabbed on and pulled him back up and out of the water, dragging him onto the cement. Jack was panicked, but that made sense because he'd just had a pretty harrowing experience. I soon learned, though, that wasn't why he was so on edge. He jumped up to his feet, went to grab his shoes and shirt, and told me to get mine as well. I hesitated, not exactly sure what had Jack so excitable. He yelled at me to do what he told me right now. I did so quickly. We went to the fence, and I cut myself on a barb this time as we jumped over. Jack jumped from the top of the fence down to the ground. He twisted his ankle slightly, but that didn't stop him from running. When we finally got back to my place, Jack finally told him what caused him to fall and be so alarmed when he looked at me. He'd seen a man approaching me silently from behind, holding what looked like a small hatchet. The man had emerged from the showers and was only a few steps away from me, raising his hatchet to attack when Jack had fallen in. That caused me to immediately swim away from the man. When I pulled him out, the man was not there anymore. He thought he saw the man hiding in the shadows of the room, though, waiting for us to go through it. Regardless, he wanted to get over that gate and out of that place immediately. Normally, I might not have believed him. It seemed like such an outlandish story. I mean, why would this random guy with a hatchet be in the locker room of the local swimming pool at that time? But even 30 years later, he maintained it was absolutely true. And the reason I believe him is that my buddy is not the type to get scared of much of anything. Decades later, though, this story still freaks him out the very same as that night. So I'm pretty sure he's telling the truth. I bought my first home about 10 years ago. It was a townhouse with 3 stories and a basement. I also had a tiny fenced-in backyard. I wasn't really great at meeting new people, so I really didn't know how to go about introducing myself to the neighbors. I didn't really have to make the first introduction, though. I was in the backyard getting ready to give the very small lawn a mowing when I heard someone behind me call out to me. After a brief startle, I turned around and noticed a man, maybe in his mid-60s, standing in the backyard of the adjacent house. We made pleasant introductions and the usual neighborly small talk. I told him where I was from and what I did for a living. He told me how long he'd been living in the house he owned and what the neighborhood was like. It was a very friendly talk. However, strangely enough, he asked me, "Did you hear about what happened in your basement?" I had no idea what he meant by that. I told him the basement was completely fine, but he insisted and asked if I had heard what happened in it. I told him no and asked for him to elaborate. Instead, he shook his head and told me it would be a good idea to talk to my realtor for the whole story. Apparently, they're required by law to tell me those sorts of things. He didn't want to get into it himself. Looked like it was something unpleasant he didn't want to talk about. It was quite a weird experience, but I tried not to think too much about it. Even if something had happened in my basement, that was all in the past. I wasn't too worried about it, and thus I did not call my realtor, nor did I ever talk to my neighbor about it again. He didn't bring it up again either in the couple of months after I'd moved in. An odd experience took place one night, though, when I had some family over to see the house. We had a small barbecue in the backyard. The neighbor that had told me about the basement initially, his name was Mike. He was over as well, hanging out with me. He did not bring up the basement at all once again. I guess he felt that whatever had happened was just between me and the people who sold me the house. After everyone had left after having stayed up late drinking beer together and talking, I was still in the backyard cleaning everything up. It was dark outside, but I had a nice patio light that kept the place looking really good. I was cleaning up the grill facing the house when suddenly something caught my eye. I quickly glanced over at the basement door, where I very distinctly saw the face of a young lady pressed up against the window of the basement. This person was clearly watching me as well. I was so startled I literally fell backwards on my butt. Despite that, I looked back at the door and distinctly saw this lady watching me and following me with her eyes. After a few moments, though, the person turned away from me and appeared to walk down the basement stairs on the other side of the door. I didn't have my cell phone on me. The basement wasn't accessible from the house either, so I didn't have to worry about someone sneaking into my home or something. I ran up the stairs to my back door, got on the phone, and called the police about the incident. I kept an eye out the back window to see if the lady had at any point tried to leave. I didn't see her doing that, though. The police soon arrived, and I gave them the basement key. They went down there and found nothing out of the ordinary. One of the officers even copped a bit of an attitude with me, thinking I knew the history of the house and that I was playing a prank on them. I had no idea what they were talking about. It was then explained to me that 20 years ago, the house was empty. A woman in the neighborhood had been kidnapped while out on a jog and kept in the basement. When someone finally broke in, she was unfortunately found dead down there. I was unaware of any of this, however. Many people in the town knew about it, so they may have just been playing a prank on me. I don't know, but I never saw anyone in the basement ever again. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around the custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case. There were some experiences he related that I had previously been unaware of regarding my ex's behavior at networking events. After this initial call, he started to call on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. Mind you, this was not someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was also much older than I was, but claimed to be very experienced with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. His testimony was really important to my case, per the words of my lawyer. I kept things strictly friendly, but I always got a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day, and that happened to be a day my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me. Honestly, I really appreciated that. After that, though, he kept on dropping by the house uninvited, or would stop by with various gifts for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to simply keep things polite. The divorce was coming soon anyway. I really couldn't afford to make this guy mad. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key that same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after that day, he came around once again uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls altogether and took my son and dog to stay at my parents' for several weeks to avoid another drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he must have gotten the hint by now. It was a very quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing. Something like the zoo, I believe. We both came back quite hot and tired. I put my kid down for a nap in my bed and decided to lay down and close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later. It took me a moment to realize that something was way off here. As I was blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table. I had most definitely not put that there. There was a post-it note on it as well, something about planting it in the yard. I recognized the handwriting immediately and stood up to go splash some water on my face. I tried to decide whether to simply call my parents or phone the police. As I stepped in my bathroom, I realized the mirror was now covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages, love notes, and calls of affection. Honestly, it really scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how all this could have possibly gotten into my house in the hour I was asleep. The front door was still definitely locked. As I went from room to room, though, there were notes placed everywhere. I mean thousands of post-it notes, covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started to grab all of them and put them into a big pile. Then I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. You know, you're really cute when you think no one is watching you. I realized then that there was a security camera pointed right where that note had been left. The one that man had helped me set up months earlier, when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics. I sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, this was during a custody battle. He said instead he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. That was the initial purpose, at least. This man had access, though, and could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. The security cameras, I realized, he had copied my passwords when I was setting up the system. The only way I could figure out that he got into my house is he must have made a copy of my house key the day I gave it to him. Because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to try to warn me either. That scared me the most. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes very quickly. He must have been right next to me, feet away from my son while we were both sleeping, and somehow he thought all this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what the guy was going to do when he realized he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night. I was home alone, on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., the man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all of the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking as well. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts as well, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had secretly befriended my mom on Facebook, and therefore was still able to see all of the photos of us she posted or shared. I saw when she left her computer logged on that they were having a conversation about how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing up. I'm more than relieved he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online now. I changed all the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends. I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos. I was already traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. Alright, here we go. Nearly a year ago now, on Christmas Day, I was at my dad's with some of my siblings. We celebrated Christmas. Then after dinner, my dad headed off to be with his girlfriend at her apartment. Left in the house were my 16-year-old uncle, my 16-year-old brother, me who was 15, and the youngest who was still only a toddler. I woke up early the next morning, the day after Christmas, and sat on the floor beside an outlet on my tablet. Everyone else was still sleeping when I began to hear a banging on the back door. At first, I thought it was my dad coming back, but the banging got louder and went on for far too long. For lack of a better term, I guess I dissociated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move until I heard the back door breaking in. I had been paranoid about home invasion due to our area in the city before, but I had no idea what to do in this situation. All I could do was stand there in shock. I put down my tablet slowly and picked up a nearby flashlight. I think my thought process was to attack whoever broke in with it. When the back door gave out, I heard the person quickly go through the downstairs and stomp up the stairs. It seemed he stopped right outside the door of the room I was in. The man opened the door, turned left, turned right, and then saw me sitting there on the floor, beside the outlet less than 3 feet away from him. He was taller than my dad, wearing a completely black ski mask. He held a big rusty crowbar with a blue handle. He was wide and looked a bit on the older side as well. In that moment, I took a small breath and screamed louder than I ever have before. It must have lasted for a good 20 seconds. Once I screamed, he yelped a bit too, then ran downstairs and out of the house. I went to the top of the staircase after he was already down them and out the hallway. I screamed out for him to please leave. Looking back, I guess asking a house invader to leave is kind of useless, especially when he's already leaving and he'd already broken in. But I'm sure you can imagine I was not thinking at my best in the moment. My screaming woke up my uncle and older brother. I told my older brother what just happened, as he was half awake and extremely confused. I ran downstairs. My uncle had just come up from his room in the basement. I quickly told him someone had broken in and left after I screamed at them. He already had a knife on him and told me to grab one too. I did after making sure the robber had left the house and checking quickly on the toddler, who was somehow sleeping through all of this. My uncle told me to guard the back door and stab anyone who came through, while he checked the area outside. We could find neither hide nor hair of where the robber had gone. I held the knife and stood beside the broken back door, knowing that if he came back, I really couldn't do anything. I'd never fought anyone before, and I was just a child holding a small knife. Thankfully, they didn't try to return. My uncle came back and said they must have had a getaway driver, since there was no way he could have gotten away so fast on foot. None of us had phones, so my older brother called my dad over Instagram on a tablet to tell him what happened. We explained everything. We all sat and waited for my dad. We talked and realized this had likely been very planned. The invader came in when there was no car in the driveway, and after entering, he ran directly upstairs, ignoring all the new Christmas presents, the electronics, an expensive alcohol collection, and even 2 easy-to-grab game consoles smack dab in the middle of the living room. He went directly for my dad's room, where me and my brother were. My dad collects valuable shoes, and I guess has some expensive watches he keeps in the closet. Only someone who was friends with my dad, who'd been in the house before, would have known about those collections, and known the right place to go as well. When my dad came back, he asked me over and over about how the intruder looked. I told him again and again, while he and my uncle tried to think of which friend it could have been. I was the only one who'd saw the guy, and had been less than 3 feet away from him. I was in direct physical danger from some stranger I'd never met. We didn't call the cops, as the police in our area are known for being less than unhelpful. As Christmas is getting closer again, I'm worried about being back there around the same time that person broke in. I've had a harder time sleeping, and I've been more paranoid as well. I understand I was and am very lucky that I wasn't hurt, and all we got was a broken back door. But honestly, I really hate the person who broke in. I really hope that wherever he is, nobody likes him. I've hesitated to share this story for a long time, because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord/maintenance staff is. I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories before about dangerous, scary residents I encountered while working at apartment complexes, but this is a story about the other side of things as a renter. Before I had even graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at the time, drawn in by the multiple amenities I would never use, but I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet-friendly and also within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment they had available and moved in. Unfortunately, I soon came to realize this apartment was not as nice as I'd originally thought it was. The building was old but remodeled, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and extremely thin walls. I also learned it was not the safest part of town either. I was primarily an online student, but I had one class that met in person twice a week, around 8 a.m. or so. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the day, except for that class. Maybe the occasional shopping excursion or to spend some time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle. Even though it was only 600 square feet and I lived alone, things had a way of growing legs and simply walking away and disappearing. I had 2 kittens at the time and blamed them regularly for all these things going missing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I'd find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I knew I had class. I didn't have a proper dresser, instead using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes. You know, one for socks, one for pants, one for pajamas, etc. I could have sworn I'd put the underwear box away after getting ready for class, but I simply chalked it up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up so early. Arguably paranoid, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well. Favorite articles of clothing would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back out. And towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called me to let me know his roommate had accidentally locked him out of their apartment. I had a spare key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick and let him in. Before I left, I made a mental note that I had left literally every light in my apartment on. Because I was living on a pretty tight budget, normally I'd make a point of turning off all the lights when I left, but my boyfriend lived like 5 minutes away, so I knew I was going to be back very quickly anyway. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. Immediately, though, I could sense something was off. I could see the lights were now off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and went inside. The lights had all been turned off. Thinking maybe I'd had a power outage, I flipped the main light, only for it to immediately come on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment. No one was inside, but someone had definitely gone through and systematically turned off every light, including my lizard's basking light, my laptop as well. We called the emergency maintenance number, and I explained that someone had been inside my apartment. They had to have used a key, because there was no sign of forced entry either. The manager called me back and told me I had to be imagining things. Maybe I'd just forgotten before I left. I assured him I wouldn't have turned off the lizard light to kill my own lizard. Someone had definitely been in my apartment. I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or had been a previous tenant or guest. I asked if they had changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me they changed the locks every time. They then tried to suggest maybe it was a friend pranking me, someone else I had given a key to. Well, the only other people I had given keys to were my boyfriend and my mom, one of which was obviously with me right now. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way anyway. After enough finagling, the manager finally agreed to send someone out to change the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern it was someone on staff, since they would be the only other people with keys. The manager claimed the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera as well. They changed the locks, but I had my doubts it would do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance guys that worked on the complex, one nice older man that didn't seem all that skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard who gave off a very bad vibe. I suspected it was him immediately. When I had first moved in, the manager had told me I would be getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come. Then after a few months, I had completely forgotten about it. One day, I was sitting in my living room, and this scruffy maintenance guy walked in without knocking or announcing himself. I hadn't received a notice to expect him either. He said he was there to replace my countertop, but it took him 2 days to install one small piece of the counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower when I heard a single knock at the door. I called out and hurried to get some clothes. Not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut, still wrapped in a towel, to stop him from just coming in. He claimed he hadn't heard me, but I had my doubts. Another time, I found a note from him that he had come in while I was gone. Again, no reason given as to why. He made a note about my third cat being cute as well, except I didn't have a third cat there. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I kept all my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note in my file that A, I wanted at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward, and B, to always be present when they tried to come in. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all added up together. It hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all the time, so he must have known when I would come and go. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen? He could have been coming in while I was asleep, and I would have never known. After the night with the lights, I put my own lock on the door. I still didn't totally trust the apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, subleased the apartment, and moved. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff. While she was home alone, as I was at class, she caught the scruffy maintenance guy trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said he was there to paint the front door. I didn't receive any notice, and he didn't have any supplies either. She told him he could wait until after I moved out. A few years later, I was shopped by the owner of Paradise Apartments while working at another complex in town. Shopping, by the way, is when an employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information they might not easily give up. There were certain tells a shopper always gave. Asking specifically worded questions that required specific answers and were easy to trip up on. Being too wealthy for the complex, being too flexible on what they were interested in. The guy seemed too old and too well off to be considering an apartment at where I worked. Normally, I wouldn't have badmouthed any other complexes. I preferred to win them over by showing them the positives of our community, but I told him I probably wasn't the best person to tell him about Paradise Apartments. I told him about my breaking in, and that I suspected it was someone on the maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed he was now the owner, and was very disturbed to hear I'd had this experience. He asked me to describe the man in detail. I assured him it was all in past and I was over it, but he insisted on calling the manager. He answered that yes, there had been a scruffy young maintenance man he'd had to fire because he'd been caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me the issue had been resolved and asked if I would be willing to change my bad review. I told him no. None of this changed the fact I'd experienced this. Actually, it validated everything I expected. In the years I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time. From my experience, a lot don't switch out the locks if the previous tenant was good. A lot didn't require background checks for employees even though they did for the tenants. And keys also got passed out willy-nilly to maintenance and vendors and basically everyone who worked there. I wouldn't go so far as to say everyone operates this way, but everyone I worked at was doing this when I started there. If you're renting an apartment, be sure to stay diligent. If you have reason to believe someone is coming into your home, document it and let the staff and friends know. You never know who might have a key to your apartment. They seem to give those things out to everyone. So here's my story. For context, I live away from home for school, while my sister lives at home with our parents. Also, both our rooms face the street and are right next to each other. I have a full-length mirror in my room just opposite the window, so if I look into the mirror, I can see what's outside as well. Around Thanksgiving of 2021, I had just gotten home from school and was relishing my ability to stay up late. So was my sister. After our parents had gone to sleep, I was just laying on my bed watching some YouTube. I had my window blinds wide open, when for some strange reason, I felt the sudden need to look up immediately. My head snapped up to look in the mirror. Outside, I saw someone pop up from below my window. They began to bang on it 3 times before suddenly sprinting away. I was shaking, on the verge of tears. I ran to my sister's room and explained what just happened. She was shaken up as well, but we chalked it up to just a dumb teenager. Just a few nights later at midnight, though, I see a text from my sister. "Hey, did you hear that? There was somebody in front of my window." I felt that same fear. I took my headphones off and just began to get up when I heard 5 super loud bangs come from my sister's window. I ran over immediately. She looked really shaken. She told me the man ran to the other side of the house, the wall that was right next to my bed. He began to bang on my wall, right where my head would normally be. We were frozen in fear. We didn't catch the guy as he ran away immediately after. We made some theories as to who it was, but neither of us were the type to have any enemies. We did some investigating and also found out there were no teenagers on our street anyway. None of this made sense. Sometimes I feel that same chill in the air and think I hear the banging. I fear turning around and seeing that man's face in the window might not be as rare as many might hope. I'm praying I never have to meet that person again.